As I rode out one bright May morning to view the meadows and flowers gay, whom should I spy but my own true lover, as she sat under yon willow tree. I took off my hat and I did salute her. I did salute her most courageously.
Oh God, there's a fly has just landed on your head, like Mike Pence. Hold on for a second. Gone. Okay.
Steve Ahoida agus Fáilte Róg dí féile leitithe Kirkagreena. Welcome everyone to the Dingle Literary Festival. I'm beyond excited to present Gabriel Byrne, award-winning actor and writer, more importantly, of Walking with Ghosts. And we're here this evening to discuss his memoir. So my first question for you, Gabriel, is could you tell me a little bit about what prompted you to write your second memoir?
Well, I had written the first one in pretty much of a rush, and I had discarded it from my mind after a while. And I think, at this stage of my life, I wanted to look back and examine the influences that made me, the religious, cultural, social, familial influences that made me who I am, and also the place where I came from and how that affected me. And we all have that journey in our lives. We all have, like a structure beneath us. And I wanted to look at that and see how it affected me and see how I became the person that I am and why I chose to become an actor, because I'm actually not a very social person. I am sociable, but I'm not social. I'm a person who has always had difficulty in social situations. Like if I go into a social situation and I see a dog or a cat, a dog or a little kid, that's where I am, because they're easier to deal with than adults,
I get that too.
There's a cartoon in the New Yorker, which I've always remembered, and it's a room full of people in tuxedos and dresses and glasses of champagne. And there's a man standing outside ready to go in, and he's just saying to himself, oh, grown-ups. And I've kind of always felt like that. So it felt, writing the book was a way for me to talk and to kind of express who I am. And I realized that memory is to a great extent composed of images. We remember the past imagistically, and images are connected to memory and imagination in a very powerful way. So when I thought about the images and I tried to sensually, I don't mean sexually, but sensually recall the smells and the sights and the sounds of that world that I grew up in, I felt that I could get some way towards expressing, who I am.
Yeah, and that's actually very evident from Walking with Ghosts, like from the opening scene when you're on the hill and you're talking about how things are now and how they were. There's this great kind of melancholic thread that goes through the whole memoir, which is kind of this is how things used to be and this is how they are now, and observing that passing of time. Like it's really beautiful, but I have to say, I remember when I finished it, I felt really sad in a very like happy way, but I could feel
Yeah.
the leaden sense of time.
Yes, I mean, time is something that I used in terms of a kind of understructure that there's a clock ticking in all our lives, whether we're very conscious of it or not, and it gets louder and sometimes faster. The clock goes crazy, like the clock in Bergman's Wild Strawberries, where the hands just go crazy. And the reason I started it in that landscape on a hill was because a hill allows you a panorama. It allows you a wide view. And I wanted a wide view of the landscape that had changed, but also how internally I had changed as well, and how the seasons of nature and how my own seasons are something that I think about. Wordsworth wrote a beautiful poem called Lines Over Tintern Abbey, in which he reflects on his life through nature, and he sees himself as a young boy. I think he describes it as like a doe bounding over the landscape, and now he's a thoughtful, introspective man looking out at this landscape and realizing that nothing stays the same, nothing changes. But for a moment, just for a moment, the illusion is there that nothing has changed. So time is, time is something that beats through the book. The other theme I would say is the theme of identity. Like, who are you? Who were you then? Who are you now? And in the second chapter, I wrote a book about when I was living in New York on the 24th floor of a skyscraper. I don't know why I was living there, but I wanted to be near my kids. I was divorced at the time. And somebody had said, "Oh, you should live in that building. It's a really good building." And it was a very strange experience, because you go from the racket and roar of Sixth Avenue into this absolutely deathly quiet building, and you would ascend in this elevator and get out on the 24th floor, and the elevator would always make this wind sound as the doors closed, and I would go into this apartment. And I would look out and I would see all the other apartments around me. And it looked to me like they were movies being played out in each apartment. And that's one of the things, as you know, about living in New York. It is a city where you can look into other people's, if you live in these kinds of houses, you can look into people's lives. A lot of Americans, or a lot of people in New York, are unconcerned with the neighbours looking in the window. In Ireland, you'd die if you thought the neighbours were looking in at you, to see what you've got. Like, I remember that expression. Yeah. They'd want to see what you were having for your breakfast. That one, but anyway, I thought of myself there, and I thought of myself as somebody who came from a rural pastoral landscape in this concrete tower. And what was left to me there, I found, was my imagination. Like, I imagined what those lives were like. The little boy having to do his piano lesson, and the two people making love in the room, who I met later in the night sitting in the bar of the restaurant. And I had seen them through the window make love. And there they were at the counter. And the girl said, "Hey, I know you." And she said, "Who are you?" She said to the guy who was with her, who is he? You know him, And that to me summed up like a profound question that we all have to ask ourselves. Who am I? Who are you? Who are you without the mask? You know, how authentic are you in relation to other people? And so I tried to bury stuff like that within the book. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. Maybe I was trying to be too clever. But I thought at one stage of writing maybe some essays, you know. But I thought it's more powerful to filter those ideas through your own emotional experience, because then you're writing from a place where you know really well, and it's not distanced by the formality of the essay. And I talked about education there, and how education was actually a deconstruction of the identity. Whatever identity you were trying to fragilely build up was removed. You didn't ask questions. You did what you were told. You absorbed what you were asked to absorb. And the idea was that you'd become a good little boy to go out
I
into the world.
actually have a quote here from the book that I loved. When you talk about being in university, and you said that that it was like an extension of school, like waiting for a flight in an airport for 4 years. And I thought that was brilliant. I loved that line so much. The sense of just waiting to get out of education, you know, and out of that formality.
Mm. Well, as George Bernard Shaw said, and I think it's a great quote, and I think it's really true. He said his education really began when he left school, and I would share that. I always felt that I was being told what to learn. I was being told what to think. And it took me a long time to get out of that and learn to think for myself, and to learn that it was okay to do that. And it was okay to be different and not to think like everybody else. And so when it came to decisions that I made in my life, I had such a distrust of authority, that I didn't listen to what people told me. People said, you have to teach, you have to stay as a teacher, you have to get the A post, you have to retire, and you know, and I thought that's a nice, fine life, but it doesn't suit me, and I want to see who I am out in the world. I know I left Ireland, I left London, I left New York, I left Los Angeles, and I took decisions that in retrospect might have been risky, but I'm glad I took them. And they were painful, some of them, because when you make a decision to leave your country, it is it becomes more and more profound as time goes by.
There's always a greater question of why you left. I even found that, like, from the places I've been, it's when you then talk about home, and normally you talk about them with a degree of nostalgia, you know, and you're kind of explaining Ireland to other people. And then the more you go on, you reach a point where you're like, well, why did I leave? And normally you remember why, and that kind of incites you to go further, you know. But it's an interesting position to be in, I think, explaining your home to other people when you're not there, you know.
Yeah, and some people tend to look back nostalgically, bordering on sentimentality about the place that they come from. I don't have sentimentality about it. I have a pretty realistic idea of what home means, because I've been searching for it for a long time. And I think, for example, religion understands that universal, profound need that people have for home, because heaven is the ultimate home. Not that I'm advocating, you know, that kind of but it's interesting that they understood that, the yearning for home. It's something that I think is deeply embedded in the human psyche and in the human consciousness. So a lot of people are conflicted about what it is. Even people who've lived in the same place all their lives. If you really scratch beneath the surface, and you get them to articulate what they mean by belonging, it's very interesting to belong to a home and a community and a family.
Completely. I remember we discussed this when we first met, and I had just come to New York, and I was kind of wondering those things myself. I was like, what is home, and how do I frame it for other people, especially when I'm so far from it? But I wanted to ask you actually about, you talk about how you left Los Angeles and London and New York, and you left Ireland. And did you find that every time you moved somewhere new, you had a greater understanding of what home meant to you? Or was it something that made sense later in life?
Yeah, it's a paradox because home gets further away and it gets closer. I don't know how to explain that, but
I like that.
the things that you value about home are sometimes things that you have moved on from. You establish a new community, you establish roots in a different way. But because the memory of home is also connected with the first sensual awakening of the world, you know, your first sights and sounds and smells and so forth. And that's deeply rooted in you. I miss the landscape of Ireland as much as I miss the people or the humor. The landscape is very comforting to me. And I think it's no accident that, you know, I've ended up in Maine, which is a very kind of pastoral. You know, people have come down here have said, "Oh, geez, it looks just like, you know, Cork or somewhere." I wouldn't say it looks like Cork, but it's a comforting landscape to me. I like to see fields and meadows and streams and woods. That's where I'm most happy. And I'm not really happy in concrete. And I think I made that statement in the book. I have never actually really loved concrete. And I don't like to have to look up at things like you do in New York. The times I have been the happiest have been in the countryside, walking along. I think John McGahern talked about that once, where he talks about walking the lanes of Leitrim. And he described it really beautifully, because he said, it's a moment of intense euphoria. Just as you try to grasp it, it's gone. And I have felt that euphoria walking in nature, and wishing that it could last forever, but of course understanding that it doesn't. Somebody like McGahern wrote so beautifully about landscape and how landscape is a part of who you are. And I think Irish people carry their home with them. They carry the landscape, and they carry memory inside them. And memory it can be an unreliable narrator, and closer to imagination than fact.
I think, yeah, that's really beautifully put. I think another comfort that comes from nature is that it roots you to something. It reminds you of your presence in the world. I've always found that with, like, there's certain places where I know the landscape very well, and every time I return to that landscape, it's like a touchstone. You know, it's like a marker that you can judge yourself against. And I found that in walking with ghosts, that it felt like in many ways the landscape of Dublin was a useful touchstone for you to come back to and to reference to and to kind of measure things against. Do you find that with landscape?
Yes, I find it. I mean, I call the book Walking with Ghosts because, you know, everything passes, including landscape. And landscapes can be haunted by ghosts too. And in Sixth Avenue in New York, I can never look down Sixth Avenue and not see the ghosts of the Twin Towers. When you look over a landscape that you're familiar with in Ireland, and you see, you know, like I described there, where there was a farm and now there's a block of apartments. Well, the farm haunts that landscape for me, not for the people who live there. And when I talked about going to the house that I was brought up in, and stood outside that house where 8 of us were reared, and I looked in, and as I looked in, a man came out the door. And he looked at me suspiciously, and asked me what did I want, and I said, no, nothing. I used to live here. And the door had opened a fraction, and I saw into where our kitchen used to be, and it was an extension that they had built on through half the garden, just in that split second. And I realized that home doesn't belong to you. That idea that you have of that memory doesn't belong to you anymore. That man is creating his own memory and his own home in that place. So that house in its own way was haunted by my own memory of what the house was, and it didn't belong to me anymore.
Oh,
But
I
that's
really
okay.
like that. I
Yeah,
think that's really well put.
I think it's what I feel. I mean, somebody said, "Oh, did you write the book for some kind of?" No, I know I didn't write it for some kind of any therapy or anything like that. I wanted to see what I'd actually learned in life, and the reality is that I haven't learned that much, really. But one of the things I do strive for is an acceptance of reality as it is, and it's very difficult. I find it a difficult pursuit because I want things to be different. And I wish it wasn't like that. And I wish it was something else. So accepting the reality of the present as it is without trying to make it different is what I've learned. And I still am trying to learn that. Because out of that acceptance comes contentment.
I think that's a noble endeavor. I don't think I'm there yet. I think
No, me neither.
I spend a lot of time trying to take stock of the way things are, but I think actually just coming back to an earlier point, what you're saying about how landscape is changing, right, and how landscape is haunted by ghosts, but they're the ghosts that we all see in our own minds. You kind of have to reconcile yourself with the fact that like reality is all in your own head in a way, because you're looking at that house and seeing one thing, and the person who lives there, their reality of that house is completely different. And yet both realities are completely valid. You did live there, you do have those memories that this person will never have, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a very good point. And I think also when you think about, say, one's parents, the memories that they have will never be your memories, and the desire of the person to transmit their memory to you is something that's doomed to failure. You can't know what that's like. I wrote about my mother and father and that generation of women who did not have access to the opportunity that the generation that followed them did. And with the result that when they came to the end of, I'm talking about specifically about my mother now, but also true of other mothers of that time, when they came to the end of their lives, were they satisfied knowing that the choices that they had were so limited? In those days, a woman got engaged, she got married, she had a family if things went well, and she was in charge of the house. Husband worked. That was the way it was. Society and culture endorsed that. And at the end of what I feel sorry sometimes for is, you say, with the collapse of the Catholic Church, which gave structure and ritual to society, whatever one thought about its teachings, that people who were robbed of that in their later days, who had given their lives to the church and to the faith, the unquestioned faith, and then found themselves disillusioned because of where the church had disappointed them. But life also had disappointed a great many of those women because of the kind of cultural and societal room that they were locked into. And I cannot understand my mother and father's generation, really, much less their mothers and fathers' generation. And I don't think my kids understand my generation, not because I'm an old fuddy-duddy or they were old fuddy-duddies, but because we cannot understand, as you said, their reality, how they experienced reality. And memory itself is a fractured thing too. What you remember and what I remember are utterly subjective.
But I think that's where art comes into all of it. That is a bridge that attempts to communicate between those two gulfs, that's trying to show something or to say something that can't be said. It's actually my favorite thing about walking with ghosts. was the very end when you were writing about your parents, and there was this great poignancy to it, I think, because there's a bit in it where you're describing a meal that you have with your father, and it's sort of like everything that's not said while you're there, and there's like a waiter and he's asking all these questions about the food and stuff, and I just find it so beautiful because it reminded me of all of those events that happen and encounters you have with people when there's something that's trying to be communicated and it just can't be in words, and both parties are trying so hard to be understood and to make themselves clear. And sometimes it succeeds and sometimes it doesn't, but it's that endeavor in itself is eternal, I think. But I also think that that art comes in to try and remedy that, and books, especially literature, has always done that for me. It's communicated something that that often I can't get any other way. But yeah.
I would totally agree with that, and I think that silence or that unease in communication that you talk about it's not just true of, say, parents and children, but I think that we all, like, how much can we ever know anybody? First of all, how much can we know ourselves? But I think every one of us has a kind of a secret room in our heads that we hold the key to. And who gets into that room? Are we ever so completely honest with another person that we can say, there's nothing else you can know about me? There's no secret desire. There's nothing in my head that you don't know. I don't know that you can get to that place, really. Because I don't know that you can even get to it yourself. I mentioned in the book that Eugene O'Neill said we're all haunted by the masks that we wear and the masks that others wear. So, who are we when we take off that mask alone? And is it ever possible for two people to totally remove that mask and be 100% absolutely, totally honest? I don't even know if it's a good thing, actually. But we strive to say things, and you're absolutely right. I mean, literature, in the absence of mentors or any kind of guided advice that I longed for as a teenager and as a young man, I went looking for myself in poetry and in books. That's where I went looking for myself. Did I find myself there? I thought sometimes I did. I went looking for myself in films, and I went looking for myself in the church. These were places where I felt something of me might be reflected back to me. And I started off with the Irish writers, people like Brian Moore and John O'Foyline and Frank O'Connor, Ed O'Brien, those people, because I wanted them to articulate what I couldn't articulate for myself. And not just about me, but the world that I lived in, which was an Irish world. And somebody like Ed O'Brien opened my eyes that language could actually reveal those things that we cannot articulate for ourselves. She did it. She was the one who shone the light into the dark areas in every way. She and McGahern and those great writers who led the way really to where we are now.
And do you remember, was there a specific Edna O'Brien book that kind of was like the penny drop in your mind? Is there any particular book that you think of constantly when you're thinking of like a literary kind of touchstone?
It's hard for me to choose one of her books, really, because she has written with such beautiful elegance and grace and knowledge of humanity, that you can get it in books as varied as The Country Girls, which she wrote in 6 weeks when she was, I think, 24, 25 or something, right up to her latest book, Girl. What I admire about that is that Edna is nearly 90 years of age, and she could rest on her laurels. And at 88, she went to Nigeria with the intention of sitting down with these. That kind of impulse, that kind of desire to keep to keep changing, to keep developing as an artist is something I so admire. She opened the world for me. McGahern did. When McGahern wrote The Dark and I took that book up and the first word in it was fuck, I said, okay, now this is a book I can get into. Because I'd never seen that word written down before in an Irish novel. And so I wasn't learning specifically about myself, but I was learning about the world I lived in. And they led to other writers. And I branched out and became addicted to reading.
And was there any book actually that inspired walking with ghosts in any way? Like any book that was kind of swirling around in your mind as you were writing that you were thinking of emulating, or just thinking that it was kind of like a silent mentor, as books can be often?
Yeah, not one in particular, but I like simplicity of language, and I don't like long, wordy, complicated descriptions of things. There's an exercise in acting, which is an interesting one. It's called sense memory. And when I studied at the Focus Theatre in Dublin for about 2 months, I never really went to any drama school, but I remember being there and being asked to do a sense memory exercise. That is, you take the character that you're playing in rehearsal and you think about the sense life of that person, the sense recall of that person's life. How do they brush their hair? How do they stand? How do they sit? Do they have any physical tics? Just thinking about the character in that way rather than just walking on the stage and saying the lines. So when it came to writing, the writers that I admired, like Steinbeck, Hemingway, Kent Haruf is a favorite of mine. Raymond Carver is a favorite of mine. The thing that you sent me the other day, actually, Max Porter's essay, which I just read in one, like, I read it and I thought, yeah, there's not a wasted word there. I love that. Like, he must have chopped away like a good sculptor does, knocked off bits and pieces and got this thing that just read so beautifully. And it's like watching George Best play football, or it's like watching a great actor. You come out and you say, God, they made that look effortless. And I want to be able to emulate that. So you'd come out of a football match watching a great player, and you'd, get the ball out and you'd run up and down the footpath and you'd try to be that. So when I read great writers, it's the simplicity and the images that get to me. And images, I think movies are about images, and the difference between movies and, say, theater is that, yes, in a movie you remember what you see, you remember the image. In a play, you don't remember the image so much as you remember in a very different way. And years later, when you recall them, you can say, oh yeah, I remember that scene where Woody Allen was standing by Brooklyn Bridge. You remember Shakespeare's play and you say, God, yes, I remember that moment when Hamlet talks about Ophelia. So they're very different. And with a novel or a poem, you're transported into a different world where your imagination is the engine that drives it. And you often hear people say, oh, I was very disappointed in that film. It wasn't like the book at all. It couldn't be like the book. It can't be like the book. I don't know what I'm talking about. I got completely lost there. Sorry.
No, I think that's very true. I think that's a really good point about how the film can never be like the book. It's true. And I used to be a bookseller, and the amount of times you hear that gripe, and it's true that they're just different mediums. you know, so that people think that they could translate so effortlessly. They can be translated, but they're different forms, you know.
If you're ever on a plane and you're looking at somebody else's TV in the seat in front of you, watch how many times that picture changes in the course of an hour and a half. Because that's the way the person watching the film is receiving that information. And that is how editing works in film. Every time there's a change of image, which happens more and more frequently in modern film. So you can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is the way your brain is interacting with that story. Whereas if you take up a book, there's a different mechanism. There's a different mechanism at play. I think very much about, say, how a movie is constructed as, say, opposed to a novel. And one day I had read years ago, I'd read Don Quixote, and in not a great translation, but I loved the book, and there's a great new translation of it out at the moment. But I realized that Cervantes in the 15th century, in 1491, or whenever he wrote it, had actually written the grammar of modern film in his novel. It's a road movie, Sancho Panza and Don Quixote. It's a buddy movie. That's what they are in the film. It's got cross-cutting, so that he dreams, cuts back to Dulcinea del Toboso, this woman that he's in love with. There is conflict, violence, and there is resolution, and there's dream sequences. All of those things have been incorporated into modern film. So both Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales and Cervantes were so incredibly far advanced at a time when people weren't writing novels, or hadn't even an idea what a film was. And then when you look at the early films that came out of Hollywood, there's no dialogue in them, and yet you understand perfectly what those stories are about. And my test of a film is, if I'm on a plane and I'm looking at a film, and I follow that film without any dialogue from beginning to end, and most of the time I can.
That's a super nugget of advice. I'm going to do that next time I find myself on an airplane.
Or you know me, if you're walking along a street at nighttime and there's a television on in a room, and you stand outside and you look at it, and you see, my God, they're showing, Fair City is on, and you say, or something is on, and you stand outside and you look at it and you say, my God, that picture is changing really fast. Now, people don't make the connection between editing in film and attention spans. There used to be a time when a close-up was a slow creep in, or a close-up was there for a reason. Now, movies tend to be about, television is very much about the close-up, and movies tend to be about fast editing and getting to the sensation quicker, whether it's sex or violence or, the car crash or whatever. And so when you're used to looking at fiction like that, it's not a huge jump for it to come into things like current affairs and politics. And the line between politics and entertainment, and between movies and the way we see the world, is very, very thin. Because when we watch movies, we absorb the values of their films. The ideas that we have about violence and about war and relationships and love and sex, to a great extent, they are formed by literature too, yes, but more so by film. And when Ronald Reagan ran for president, he ran basically as a mythical character out of movies, and so did the Bush, the younger Bush person, what's his name, George. And that's what is a certain amount of the appeal of Donald Trump, Elmer Gantry, the guy who rides into town on the horse and says, buy my medicine, it'll make your hair grow again. And people say, oh yeah, I'll have some of that. So movies and politics and movies and news are not that far apart, because news now is about this moment of sensation. And if you look at the way the news is presented, they don't hang around very long for in-depth discussions, and they don't hang around very long in their reports. Even the Weather Channel now is a drama. There's a guy with a microphone in a wind that looks like it'll blow him away. Over now to James, in the middle of a typhoon there in Mississippi. What's it like there? Well, the wind is blowing. So, you can see behind me, they've made drama out of the Weather Channel.
I think that's a brilliant point. Gabriel, I'm sorry, I could keep talking to you for ages. I'm going to take a few questions that we've sent in.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got one here from Angel in Canada, and she says, or she writes, memory and perspective are often influenced by one's sense of belonging. And how did you deal with the challenge as you reflected on your early lived experiences in Ireland after living in the USA for many years?
Yes. I used to think there's nothing as nothing as patriotic as an Irishman who lives abroad after a period of time. The first thing that happens is when you leave Ireland, you're Irish. That's what your identity becomes. You're never sitting in a pub in Kinnegad saying, do you know we're Irish? You know that. Or one fellow says with his pint, say, what does it feel like to be Irish? You don't ask that question because you are Irish. But as soon as you leave, you become identified as that nationality. And it's a good question. There's only the past and the present and the future. They're the three things. And none of them truly exist. Just like this conversation we've had is in the past already. Even the last minute's in the past. So my time in Ireland was the past. My time now is the present. So I'm comparing the present and the past rather than this country to that country.
That's a very good answer. And actually, you've got a quote from Shelley in the book, which I loved and wrote down in my own notes, which is, fear not the future, weep not for the past. I think that offers such solace as a quote. It's a really good one.
Right.
Sorry, I'll take one more question here. This is from Stella in Texas. And she says that writing and acting are both creative endeavors that require specific talents. Most people only do one. What difference did you discover as you went from one process to the other?
Well, with the writing, you're in control. Nobody's leaning over your shoulder saying, I wouldn't say that. Can you take, film by its nature is a collaborative medium, and a great performance can be cut by an editor into a bad performance, and vice versa. I think writing, reading, literature are very different things for me. Acting comes from some other part of me. I honestly, as I said in the book, I have no idea where acting comes from, and I have no idea where writing comes from, and I have no idea why one guy writes a great screenplay and another guy doesn't. And maybe it's meant to be like that. In the very ancient times, the role of the shaman was to take on the trials and tribulations and happinesses and yearnings of the tribe and act them out. And I think that's what writers and actors do in various forms, and musicians. All artists do that. And their job is to be the dogs barking before the earthquake, to warn people of what's coming.
That's brilliant. I love that. That's such a good image. Gabriel, I'm just going to ask you at the very end if you wanted to share a poem with us, one that kind of meant something to you, because I think everyone would probably like to hear you speak and not me speaking. Well,
I don't think that's true, Mia, but anyway, let me look at this thing here. I don't know how anybody else feels, but I'm almost insane from Skype and Zoom and text and email and whatever else is out there. I'm not on Twitter or Instagram, thank God, or I'd never actually sleep. This is a poem by Dylan Thomas, the great Welsh poet. And it's a poem about time and childhood. And I'm reading it off a cell phone, so please excuse me if I stumble on a word here or there. It's called Fern Hill. Now, as I, let me start again. Jeez, I just got nervous there for a second. It's ridiculous. Okay. Now as I was young and easy under the apple boughs, about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb, golden in the heyday of his eyes. And honoured among wagons, I was prince of the apple towns. And once below a time, I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns, about the happy yard and singing as the farm was home, in the sun that is young once only, time let me hail and be, golden in the mercy of his means. And green and golden I was huntsman and herdsman, the calves sang to my horn, the foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy stream. All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hay fields high as the house, the tunes from the chimney, it was air and playing, lovely and watery and fire green as grass. And nightly under the simple stars as I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the night jars flying with the ricks and the horses flashing into the dark. And then to awake in the farm like a wanderer, white with the dew, come back. The cock on his shoulder, it was all shining. It was Adam and maiden. The sky gathered again and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light in the first spinning place, the spellbound horses walking warm out of the whinnying green stable onto the fields of praise. Oh, nothing I cared in the lamb-white days, that time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft by the shadow of my hand in the moon that is always rising. Now that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields and wake to the farm, forever fled from the childless end. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea.
That was beautiful. Thank you very much, Gabriel.
I made a
I'm
bit
going to
of a
wrap.
mess of it, but I hope nobody noticed it. Thank
You
you.
didn't. You sounded great.
Okay.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me and all the people we can't see at Dingle Lit. Thank you so much, Gabriel. And everyone go out and buy Walking with Ghosts. It doesn't look like this in the bookshop. This is the proof. It's got a lovely picture of Gabriel's face on it instead. But everyone get it. It's beautiful and it might make you cry. The ending made me cry, but in a happy way. Thank you very much.
Technology, always remember this, if technology gets the better of you, just remember, and we'll finish with this image, which I know you will appreciate. Okay, take care of yourself. And thank you for everybody who looked in. And even though I can't see it, it kind of reminds me of when George Bernard Shaw was asked in 1936 what he thought about television. And he said, I'll try to do George Bernard Shaw's voice now. He said, television is it's a wonderful thing, really. Here I am, and all you people can see me, but I cannot see you.
Brilliant.
Take care, Mia. Talk to you.
Bye, Gabriel.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.